Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, March 13th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our headline today, New Iranian Leader Vows to Keep Global Oil Gateway Blocked. Oil prices surged on Thursday after ships came under attack in the Persian Gulf, and Iran's supreme leader vowed revenge for U.S. and Israeli airstrikes. By Yagana Torbati, Sanam Mahuzi, and Thomas Fuller. Iran's supreme leader struck a defiant tone on Thursday in his first public comments since succeeding his dead father, vowing to continue blocking the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point for the world's oil supply, on a day when multiple vessels came under attack in the Persian Gulf. The attacks on shipping sent panic through oil markets as they digested what the International Energy Agency called the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The price of oil rose sharply on Thursday, hovering around $100 a barrel, despite a plan by the agency, a coalition of 32 nations, to release 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves, including 172 million by the United States. Images and reports from across the Gulf pointed to widespread attacks. 2 oil tankers were burning off the coast of Iraq early Thursday. Saudi Arabia said it had destroyed 2 drones that were heading toward the kingdom's huge Sheba oil field. Kuwaiti authorities said Kuwait Airport was damaged in several drone strikes. In Oman, an important oil export terminal, the Mina El Fahal port near the capital, Muscat, closed early Thursday for security reasons, the port's operator said. Images from Bahrain showed a gray miasma drifting across the landscape after fuel tanks were struck, sending the toxic cloud of smoke into the air. And in Dubai, pictures circulated of a gaping hole in the modern, glassy facade of a skyscraper after what authorities said was an Iranian drone strike. In a statement read on Iranian state television, the new supreme leader, Mujtaba Khamenei, mourned the Iranians dead in the conflict and vowed to avenge the blood of martyrs. He especially dwelled on the school children killed in a strike that an ongoing Pentagon investigation has determined was probably a mistaken attack by the U.S. military. And he warned that Iran was studying the opening of other fronts where the enemy has little experience. Dear brother combatants, Mr. Khamenei added, the will of the masses is for continued effective and punishing defense. In a news conference later on Thursday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel was asked whether Israel would target Mr. Khamenei. He did not answer directly, but said, I wouldn't sign off on life insurance for him. Mr. Netanyahu appeared to scale back his language about overthrowing Iran's theocratic government. We are creating the optimal conditions for the overthrow of the regime, he said, but I can't say for certain that the Iranian people would topple it. A regime is toppled from within. On the 13th day of a war that has put on display the overwhelming military power of the United States and Israel, Mr. Khamenei's address appeared to underline that the Iranian leadership believes it has found an effective pressure point, choking off oil and gas to the rest of the world. Iran's military has warned that no ships can transit the Strait of Hormuz, the portal to the Gulf, through which 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes, without Iran's permission. The lever of blocking the Strait of Hormuz must undoubtedly continue to be used, Mr. Khamenei said, according to a translation by the Tasnim news agency, which is affiliated with the country's powerful Revolutionary Guards. In response to U.S. and Israeli attacks, Iran's military has launched missile and drone attacks across the Persian Gulf region and Israel, and even at Cyprus and Turkey, particularly targeting U.S. military bases and American interests, though it has also hit civilian infrastructure. It has generally not taken responsibility for specific attacks, but did claim one of the tanker strikes on Thursday and another on a cargo ship on Wednesday. Mr. Khamenei, whose father was killed by an Israeli airstrike at the start of the war, appeared to issue a warning to Iran's neighbors to sharply curtail their military cooperation with the United States. I recommend that they shut down those bases as soon as possible, because by now they must have realized that America's claim of establishing security and peace has been nothing more than a lie, he said. Hamidreza Azizi, a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and an expert on Iranian security issues, said Mr. Khamenei's statement was even more defiant in tone than his father's utterances, particularly in how explicit he was about military strategy. He gets right to the point, Mr. Azizi said. It tells a lot, I think, about the direction of the country. The International Energy Agency said Thursday that gasoline prices would rise for consumers around the globe, but that diesel and jet fuel supplies were especially at risk because of the war. Rising jet fuel prices add to a crisis among airlines based in the Gulf, where tens of thousands of flights have already been canceled because of the war. Airlines that once relied on airspace over Iran and nearby countries have been scrambling to find alternatives. Rising oil prices have also helped push interest rates up, with rates for 30-year mortgages in the United States rising 2 weeks in a row. They are now above 6%. President Trump on Thursday shrugged off the rising oil prices, arguing that preventing Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons was more important and claiming the United States would profit. The United States is the largest oil producer in the world by far. So when oil prices go up, we make a lot of money, he wrote on social media, adding that of far greater interest and importance to me as president is stopping an evil empire, Iran, from having nuclear weapons. Days after Mr. Trump floated the idea that U.S. Navy could escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz, Chris Wright, the U.S. Energy Secretary, said Thursday that the Navy was not ready to take on that duty. It'll happen relatively soon, but it can't happen now. We're simply not ready, Mr. Wright said in an interview with CNBC, adding that all of our military assets are focused on destroying Iran's military assets and its ability to manufacture them in the future. The death toll continued to rise across the region. Iran's representative to the United Nations, Amir Saeed Iravani, told the Security Council on Wednesday that more than 1,348 civilians had been killed. He did not cite a figure for military personnel. Dozens have also died in Iranian drone and missile attacks on Gulf countries and Israel. In Lebanon, Israeli bombardment has killed more than 680 people and displaced over 800,000, according to Lebanese officials. Israel launched a new wave of strikes on central Beirut on Thursday evening, saying it was targeting infrastructure belonging to the militant group Hezbollah. The heavy bombardment in a neighborhood of hip bars, high-end restaurants, and high schools came within a few hundred yards of the government's headquarters. It crystallized fears that the conflict was expanding in the Lebanese capital beyond its southern outskirts, where Hezbollah has long held sway. It also deepened the sense that corners of the city once considered comparatively safe were so no longer. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam gave a televised speech on Thursday evening, shortly after Israeli airstrikes rained on central Beirut. We cannot, under any circumstances, accept that Lebanon once again becomes an open arena for the wars of others, he said. Florida Republicans pass bill requiring proof of citizenship to vote. The proposed law, which would not take effect before this year's midterm elections, was modeled in part on President Trump's top legislative priority in Congress. By Patricia Mazzei and Nick Corasaniti. Republican state lawmakers in Florida passed a bill on Thursday that would require voters to verify their citizenship when registering and limit which forms of identification they can present at the polls. Critics say the new requirements would result in the removal of perhaps thousands of voters from the rolls and in the disenfranchisement of young voters. The bill passed in the State House by a 77-28 vote, hours after clearing the state Senate. The votes in both chambers were along strict partisan lines, with all Democrats against the measure. Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican, said in a social media post on Thursday that he supported the legislation. The bill's enactment would make Florida the most populous state in the country to impose proof of citizenship requirements on voters, a critical goal for President Trump as he seeks to maintain Republican control of Congress. But the Florida requirements would take effect next year, not before this year's midterm elections. This is about the integrity of our elections, one of the bill's sponsors, State Senator Aaron Grahl, a Republican from Vero Beach, said on the Senate floor on Wednesday. It is something that puts greater trust into our system. Under the bill, Floridians would have to provide proof of citizenship, such as a birth certificate or passport, when they register to vote. Every existing voter's citizenship would be verified against government databases, such as Real ID, when the bill goes into effect. If no citizenship document came up, the local election supervisor would notify the voter by mail. To stay registered, the voter would have to bring proof of citizenship, such as a passport or a birth certificate, to his or her county elections office. About 98% of Floridians have real IDs, according to a state motor vehicle department report in 2023, though about 872,000 residents still do not, Ms. Grahl said. Separately, the bill would no longer allow voters to use either college IDs or those provided by retirement homes to identify themselves at polling places. Republicans said those types of IDs were too easy to fake. Banning student IDs drew especially strong opposition from Democrats, who accused Republicans of trying to disenfranchise voters on a partisan basis. Young voters often lean Democratic. 8 states have banned student IDs for voting, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan organization, but 6 of them still allow voters to cast provisional ballots. This is just saying to any out-of-state students or students in Florida who do not drive, we do not want your vote, State Senator Tina Polsky, a Democrat from Boca Raton, said on the Senate floor on Wednesday. That is absolutely terrible. The Florida bill was modeled in part after Mr. Trump's top legislative priority, the Save America Act, a bill that would impose strict voter ID and proof of citizenship requirements nationally. That legislation has become so important to the president that he has said he will not sign any other bill until it passes. He has used it as leverage over Senator John Cornyn of Texas, as Mr. Cornyn seeks his endorsement in a runoff election. But studies have shown that requiring proof of citizenship across the country may end up affecting more Republicans. The states Mr. Trump won handily in 2024 have the largest percentage of citizens without valid passports, according to an analysis last year by the Secure Democracy Foundation, a nonpartisan organization that studies and analyzes voting policy. Daniel Griffith, a senior policy director for Secure Democracy USA, a group that promotes secure and fair elections and is affiliated with the foundation, said the Florida bill includes some safeguards that could minimize how many voters get left off the rolls. For example, it accepts proof of citizenship that voters have already produced in applications for other government documents, such as Real ID. Nonetheless, this is creating an issue where there are going to be a lot of impacted voters that are going to need to produce that passport or that birth certificate, he said. And on the margin, you're going to have eligible citizens who are not going to be able to vote. Federal law is clear that only American citizens can vote in federal elections, and evidence suggests that non-citizen voting is exceptionally rare. Local investigations in Florida have also turned up little evidence of non-citizens on the rolls. Other states have adopted similar restrictions. Arizona voters passed a ballot initiative in 2004 that required proof of citizenship for registering. That law created a bifurcated system in which any state election required proof of citizenship, but voters without such proof could still participate in federal elections. Though the Arizona law has been in effect for nearly 20 years, it is still causing issues for the state's election officials. In 2024, nearly 100,000 potential voters were at risk of losing their registration because of a glitch in state data. Voters who were issued driver's licenses before 1996 might not have proof of citizenship on file. A court granted those voters relief before the 2024 election. In Kansas, Republican lawmakers passed a proof of citizenship law that took effect in 2013. In the first election that followed, 31,089 potential voters had their registrations rejected or denied because they had failed to produce documents proving their citizenship, according to federal court records. The court also found that almost all of the affected voters were citizens. The law was ruled unconstitutional and has not been enforced since 2018. But as Mr. Trump has made the Save America Act the cornerstone of his domestic agenda, more Republican-led states have tried to pass versions of it. In 2024, New Hampshire passed a law requiring the state to prove their citizenship in order to vote. The law is being challenged in federal court. Louisiana also passed a law in 2024 requiring voters to provide proof of citizenship when registering. This year, legislatures in South Dakota and Utah passed proof of citizenship laws that are awaiting signature by each state's governor. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Banking regulators plan to ease some capital requirements. The Federal Reserve and other financial regulators will soon release proposals to loosen some planned rules on how much capital banks must hold in reserve to mitigate risks. By Stacey Cowley. Federal banking regulators are preparing to release a set of proposals to loosen requirements on how much capital banks have to hold to protect against losses. In a speech on Thursday at a Cato Institute policy gathering, Michelle W. Bowman, the Federal Reserve's Vice Chair for Supervision, said the new rules would eliminate capital calculation requirements that she called duplicative and adjust them in relation to banks' trading activities and mortgage lending. The changes would modify a set of rules known as Basel III Endgame, a long-running and closely watched effort to carry out an international regulatory framework hashed out in Switzerland nearly a decade ago. Intended to mitigate the kinds of risks that contributed to the 2008 financial crisis, Basel III has been the target of intense lobbying by banks and their trade groups, which have warned about overly strict capital requirements that constrain lending to businesses and households. Capital requirements force banks to hold assets, such as cash, as cushions against future losses. Banks like to keep those buffers as small as possible, freeing up more money for them to lend and invest. Officials at the Fed, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency plan to jointly release their new proposals as soon as next week. The planned changes to the Basel III rules follow other Trump administration moves to alter banking rules in ways that supporters say will cut unnecessary red tape and unlock capital for investment. Critics fear the changes will leave regulators less able to spot a brewing crisis and banks less able to withstand one. In a joint statement on Thursday, 3 banking trade groups praised Ms. Bowman's comments about the intended Basel III changes. We have consistently called for a capital framework that reflects the actual risks in the banking system, rather than over-calibrated requirements that impede economic growth and unnecessarily drive up costs, the American Bankers Association, the Bank Policy Institute, and the Financial Services Forum said. The capital proposal outlined today suggests a welcome focus on risk sensitivity and a comprehensive view. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Banking Committee, criticized the changes as a capitulation to industry lobbying. Trump's bank regulators, once again, are handing the big banks exactly what they want: a weak rule that fails to address the severe flaws in the capital framework that were never fixed after the 2008 financial crisis, leaving our entire economy at risk, she said. Regulators also plan to propose changes to a capital requirements surcharge imposed on institutions deemed globally systemically important banks. That GSIB designation currently applies to 29 banks. The regulators' Basel III proposal would lead to a small increase in capital requirements for the largest banks, but their suggested changes to the surcharge on GSIBs would result in a modest decrease, Ms. Bowman said. Together, she said, the changes would decrease the largest banks' capital requirements by a small amount. Regional banks would see a larger decrease in capital requirements, Ms. Bowman said, which would provide flexibility to provide credit to U.S. households and businesses. 3 years ago, a series of regional bank failures, which began with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, a tech industry lender that was felled when a deluge of withdrawal requests plunged it into insolvency, rattled the banking industry. Some experts worry that easing asset requirements for such banks could increase the risk of a recurrence of those kinds of wipeouts. Senate resoundingly passes housing bill, but challenges lie ahead. The lopsided vote to approve the measure was a rare bit of election year bipartisanship on a major affordability issue, but GOP disputes and President Trump's disinterest have left its fate uncertain. By Rhonda Kaysen. The Senate on Thursday overwhelmingly passed the largest piece of housing legislation in 36 years, as Republicans and Democrats banded together to tackle a major cost of living issue just months before midterm elections in which affordability is expected to be a main focus. But the bill still faces major hurdles, as Republicans feud over what should be included, and President Trump, who backs the measure, signals that it is not a priority. The package, which passed by a vote of 89 to 10, aims to boost the supply of new housing, a critical step toward bringing down housing costs, by removing regulatory barriers, providing incentives, and preserving the existing supply. It would also set new limits on the role institutional investors play in the single-family housing market, a top goal of Mr. Trump, who signed an executive order on the issue in January. The last time Congress passed housing legislation of this scale was in 1990, when it approved a bill that created a national affordable housing strategy and grant programs to fund new construction. The measure approved on Thursday would modernize a key program in that earlier legislation. The bill, sponsored by Senators Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina, and Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts, the leaders of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, has generated a rare burst of bipartisanship in an election year. But while Mr. Trump has indicated his support, he has also cast considerable doubt in recent days on its chances of enactment. He has said he will not sign any legislation until Congress delivers him strict voting restrictions that are stalled in the Senate, leaving Republicans who are divided on the housing bill with little incentive to come to terms and push it through. Mr. Scott said the central goal of the legislation was to produce more homeowners, noting that the average age of a first-time homebuyer is now 40, which he considers too old. Let's create more homeowners at an earlier age, Mr. Scott said. The age of affordability is now, and the solution to affordability is, in fact, us. Following the legislation's passage, Ms. Warren made a plea to the House to take it up and pass it, nodding to the considerable obstacles ahead. Anybody who wants to try to block this bill is going to have to explain to the American people why we don't want to build more housing, and having that housing in the hands of homeowners, she said. Polls show that housing affordability is a top concern among voters. Home prices are up around 50% since the start of the pandemic, when low interest rates ignited a housing boom. In the aftermath of that rush to buy homes, interest rates spiked, grinding the housing market to a stop, even as prices largely held. Rents also rose dramatically during the same period. While the Trump administration has made attempts to address the crisis with changes that could make it cheaper to buy a home, the legislation focuses on supply, which is widely seen as the root of the problem. It would expand the definition of manufactured housing so factories could build homes without a steel chassis. Factory-built housing is cheaper and faster to put up than traditional stick-built homes. Other provisions in the bill would update mortgage lending standards and expand access to financing for manufactured housing. The measure would also expand access to loans to build multifamily housing, expand access to federal grants to be used for new construction, and ease some environmental review processes to speed up building. The package, a version of a similar bill that passed the House in January and one that passed the Senate last year, now moves to the House, where it faces opposition from members of both parties who are angry about some of the changes made by their colleagues across the Capitol. This has not been a bicameral effort on their part. Representative Mike Flood, a Republican of Nebraska and chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, said of the Senate in an interview. House Democrats, too, are frustrated. Representative Maxine Waters of California, the ranking Democrat on the Financial Services Committee, said in an interview that she wanted the House and Senate to negotiate to resolve their differences over the measure, signaling that it would not have the support to pass the House unless changes were made. And several right-wing Republicans, following Mr. Trump's lead, have said they will not support the housing measure or any other Senate-passed legislation until the chamber acts on the voter ID bill, which is being blocked by Democrats and currently has no clear path to enactment. Beyond the political challenges, the policy disagreements on the housing measure remain profound. The Senate added limits on the creation of a federal digital currency that some House Republicans do not think go far enough. The package would also restrict how private investors can purchase, build, and own single-family homes. Under a new proposed rule spearheaded by Senator Raphael Warnock, Democrat of Georgia, investors who own 350 single-family homes would not be able to buy more, although the rules would not apply retroactively. While the bill would allow investors to build single-family homes exclusively as rentals, it would require builders to sell those homes after 7 years, a limit that critics of the provision, including some House Republicans, argue would make it harder for developers to build new rental housing at a time when the country desperately needs new supply. About 7% of all single-family construction is built as rentals. Gone from the bill are several provisions from the original House measure, including one that addressed community banking lending rules and was championed by Representative French Hill of Arkansas, the Republican chairman of the Financial Services Committee. Odds rise that El Niño will soon bring weather extremes. The climate pattern known for intense heat, floods, and drought is likely to develop this summer, raising questions about disaster preparedness. By Scott Dance. An El Niño climate pattern that is likely to develop this summer may be severe, federal scientists warned Thursday in a forecast that raised threats of record heat, floods, and other weather extremes around the planet this year and next. The Climate Prediction Center, part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, issued an El Niño watch estimating a chance of about 80% that the phenomenon known for boosting global warmth would arrive as soon as August, a significant change from a February prediction that suggested 60% odds that the pattern would develop in the fall. During an El Niño, warmer than normal waters in the central and eastern Pacific Ocean cause weather patterns to shift in ways that drive heat waves, drought, and floods globally, but can also stunt the Atlantic hurricane season. The researchers said there is about a 1 in 3 chance the next El Niño will be at least as strong as the last one, which pushed global temperatures in 2023 and 24 above a long-feared warming threshold, 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial norms for the first time. The forecast also raises questions about whether the United States is prepared for the disasters an El Niño can trigger or intensify. The Trump administration has let go thousands of Federal Emergency Management Agency workers since early last year. A plan to overhaul the disaster agency was in limbo even before President Trump fired Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Department secretary overseeing that work, last week. Mr. Trump also oversaw the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which sent humanitarian aid to disaster-struck countries. It's like having a ship stall out in front of a tidal wave, said Jesse Antia Hughes, an associate professor of economics at the University of San Francisco. FEMA officials said in an unsigned statement that the agency monitors NOAA forecasts to position resources ahead of disasters. But, they added, an ongoing partial government shutdown affecting the Homeland Security Department threatened readiness. The administration's approach to disaster management has been largely untested so far. Reviews that Ms. Noem imposed were found to have delayed deployment of search and rescue teams and prevented victims from reaching a FEMA call center during what was perhaps the most prominent disaster of 2025, Texas floods in July that killed more than 130 people. FEMA has also slowed or blocked state and local governments' access to grants and other disaster aid that they use to prepare for emergencies. But no hurricanes made landfall on U.S. shores last year, and western wildfires burned across a smaller than average footprint. That relative quiet spell, amid an era of increasingly frequent and costly disasters, could end with a strong El Niño. El Niño, a natural fluctuation involving shifts in Pacific trade winds, last developed in May 2023 and persisted for a year, as it typically does. Scientists linked it to drought in southern Africa and flooding in the Horn of Africa, drought and wildfires in the Amazon, extreme heat stress on coral reefs, intense rainfall in Southern California, and record low winter ice cover across the Great Lakes. The El Niño pattern, marked by warmer than average Pacific waters along the equator, is known in the United States for discouraging Atlantic hurricanes, potentially easing some pressure on disaster response. But the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season was the fourth most active on record, despite El Niño. The pattern also usually increases overall precipitation from Southern California to the Gulf Coast and Florida. Its name refers to the Christ child in Spanish, and was bestowed by South American fishermen who noticed instances of warm waters in the eastern Pacific around Christmas as early as the 1600s. A waning La Niña pattern, the opposite of El Niño, bringing cooler than normal waters to the eastern Pacific, has persisted since September and is expected to end by May, NOAA said. Other forecasts have already warned about El Niño. A European climate forecasting model this month showed a much higher likelihood than the NOAA forecast that El Niño could become at least as intense as the 2023-24 event, and it also suggested a super El Niño was as much as twice as likely as NOAA's Thursday forecast indicated. The U.S. agency is predicting just a 10 to 15% chance of an extreme El Niño. The World Meteorological Organization will be carefully monitoring conditions in the coming months to inform decision-making, Secretary General Celeste Saulo said this month. The European model's forecasts caught our attention, said Nathaniel Johnson, a meteorologist at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, who was involved in the U.S. agency's forecast. But he said the predictions issued Thursday reflect a broader range of climate model analysis. There's still considerable uncertainty about the strength of the event, Mr. Johnson said. It was nonetheless remarkable, he added, that climate models were showing such strong odds that El Niño would form in the next 5 to 6 months. Predictions made at this time of year, when the systems driving El Niño are often in flux, are notoriously difficult to trust. There is unusually high confidence that El Niño is coming, Mr. Johnson said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Army officer killed in university attack that is being investigated as terrorism. The FBI said the shooting, which wounded 2 other people at the university in Norfolk, Virginia, was being investigated as an act of terrorism. By Campbell Robertson, Devlin Barrett, and Christine Hauser. An Army officer who led the ROTC program at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, was killed on Thursday when a man stormed a classroom and opened fire in an attack the authorities said was being investigated as an act of terrorism. The gunman, who the authorities said was subdued and killed by students during his attack, had been released from federal prison in 2024 after serving 7 years on terrorism-related charges. The slain Army officer was identified by Governor Abigail Spanberger as Lieutenant Colonel Brandon Shaw, who was a professor of military science and a combat veteran. According to his university bio, Colonel Shaw, a native of Virginia, had flown Apache helicopters in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, logging hundreds of hours in combat. He earned 2 Bronze Stars and 2 Meritorious Service Medals, along with other awards. The attack began just before 10:50 a.m., when, according to federal officials, the gunman entered a classroom in Constant Hall, shouting Allahu Akbar, an Arabic phrase meaning Allah is greater, that is used in daily Islamic prayers, and opened fire. Members of the ROTC, or Reserve Officer Training Corps, were in the classroom, and federal investigators were working to determine if the gunman had targeted students who are part of the U.S. military, said people familiar with the investigation. 3 people were shot by the gunman, said Dominique Evans, the FBI's special agent in charge in Norfolk, who also said that other brave ROTC members in that room subdued him before the police and other emergency personnel arrived. The victims included ROTC members, the officials said. 2 of the wounded, including Colonel Shah, were taken to Centara Norfolk General Hospital. Colonel Shah died at the hospital, and the other patient was in critical condition, the hospital said. The 3rd wounded person took himself to a hospital in Virginia Beach, according to the university police chief Garrett Shelton, and was later released. News of Colonel Shah's killing began circulating on social media on Thursday evening, and Ms. Spanberger, a former CIA officer, was among those mourning the loss. "I am grateful for his example, deeply saddened by his death, and praying for his family," she said. Colonel Shah came to Old Dominion in 2022 to lead the University ROTC battalion, having been an ROTC member himself at the school 17 years earlier. In a news conference, Ms. Evans identified the gunman as Mohammed Baylor Jalloh, who had been convicted years ago of having tried to provide material services to the Islamic State. The shooting took place just an hour and a half before a synagogue was attacked in Michigan, and amid warnings from federal officials and security groups of possible attacks in the United States in retaliation for the airstrikes in Iran over the past 2 weeks. Ms. Evans said that Mr. Jalloh had made no mention of the U.S.-Israeli war in Iran during the attack. Chief Shelton said at a news conference that calls to 911 reported that people were being shot in one of the classrooms. Students told 13 News Now of Norfolk that they were taking midterm exams and had seen a commotion or fight before hearing gunfire. By 10:50 a.m., the officials had determined that the assailant was dead. Chief Shelton said that law enforcement officers found students and faculty hiding as they swept the campus after the shooting. Mr. Jalloh, a naturalized citizen who was born in Sierra Leone, had been a member of the Virginia Army National Guard. He had decided not to re-enlist, officials said in 2017, after listening to online lectures by Anwar al-Awlaki, a leader in al-Qaeda who was assassinated by a U.S. drone strike in 2011. According to court documents, Mr. Jalloh traveled to Nigeria in 2015 and stayed for 2 weeks with a member of the Islamic State, at one point trying to join the group in the fighting in Libya. In Africa, he had made online contact with an Islamic State operative named Abu Sayyad Sudani, whom he believed was plotting an attack in the United States, federal prosecutors said. To carry out the attack, Mr. Sudani put Mr. Jalloh, who had returned to the United States, in touch with another person, who happened to be an undercover FBI source. Federal prosecutors said that Mr. Jalloh told the source that he thinks about conducting an attack all the time, that he had purchased a handgun, and that he had planned to murder U.S. military personnel in an operation similar to the mass shooting at Fort Hood in Texas in 2009. In the summer of 2016, Mr. Jalloh sent $500 to someone he was told was an Islamic State operative, but who was in fact an FBI employee. A day after he bought an AR-15 rifle from a gun store, Mr. Jalloh was arrested. He pleaded guilty in late 2016 for attempting to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. He was released in December 2024, according to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. China wants ethnic minorities to blend in. Now it's the law. Under a new ethnic unity law, Mandarin Chinese must now be the language of teaching. Parents must guide their children to love the Communist Party. Neighborhoods should be mixed. By Lily Q. Since China's leader Xi Jinping rose to power more than a decade ago, the ruling Communist Party has worked aggressively to make ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, Tibet, and elsewhere in the country identify first and foremost as patriotic citizens. Now, this campaign of assimilation has been codified into an expansive new law that makes ethnic unity the responsibility of all society, including every level of government, business owners, and parents. The law, which was approved at the close of China's legislative meeting on Thursday, has wide-ranging provisions that touch on education, housing policy, entertainment, and other areas. It embodies Mr. Xi's mission to forge a single national identity molded by the party, seen as a way to protect Beijing's rule from threats at home and abroad. While Beijing says the law will protect the traditions of all officially recognized 56 ethnic groups, a main focus appears to be assimilating minority residents into the culture of the Han Chinese, who are the majority. It orders that Mandarin Chinese be the language of instruction in schools and in official communication. Under new law, the authorities must guide citizens to have correct views on history, culture, and religion and shed outdated customs. It also requires parents to educate and guide their children to love the Chinese Communist Party. The law makes it illegal for anyone to oppose a marriage on ethnic or religious grounds and also calls for minority residents to live in mixed communities. According to James Liebold, a professor at La Trobe University in Melbourne who focuses on China's ethnic policies, the law marks the final legal capstone in Mr. Xi's hardline approach toward the country's hinterlands, like Xinjiang and Tibet, where demands for greater autonomy have in the past erupted into protests and violence. In those regions, government measures, which have included mass detentions of residents, forced political indoctrination, the separation of children from their families, and suppressing population growth, have led to the erasure of minority languages, religious traditions, and cultural norms, he said. The ethnic unity law is now mobilizing all aspects of the party, state, and society to forge a single national consciousness, Dr. Liebold said. In Xi's China, there is very little room left for diversity of culture, language, identity, or even thought. Even before Mr. Xi came to power, Chinese officials and intellectuals were debating whether decades of granting limited autonomy to minority regions had gone too far. After a string of attacks by Uyghurs, Mr. Xi oversaw an intense security crackdown and a shift in the party's ethnic policies. Officials restricted the use of minority languages in schools in Xinjiang and Tibet and other places where minority students had previously been able to choose their language of instruction. Until 2020, students in Inner Mongolia, an autonomous region between China and Mongolia, could study mostly in Mongolian. The ban caused widespread protests that were quickly put down. The new law formalizes and applies that language policy across the country. It also mandates that children must start learning the language before kindergarten, with the goal of having a basic grasp of it by the time they finish the 9 years of compulsory education. The law, which requires local governments to support minority workers and students when they move elsewhere in China, is likely to accelerate official efforts to promote migration into and out of minority regions, which some experts see as diluting minority culture. The goal is to bind China's minorities to the majority population, a relationship Mr. Xi has likened to that of a tree and its branches, where Chinese culture is the trunk and each ethnic group is a branch. Aaron Glasserman, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania who researches ethnic policy in China, said the new law demonstrates the government's confidence in its methods in Xinjiang and Tibet, despite criticism from international rights groups. It also empowers the authorities to pursue groups and people outside of China seen as undermining national unity or inciting ethnic division. Now the Chinese government is demanding this ideological uniformity, not only within its territory but also abroad, said Yalkun Ulyol, a China researcher at Human Rights Watch. That is what you call transnational repression. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. How Russia's scorched earth attacks put Ukraine's power grid near collapse. Strikes on Ukrainian energy systems have tripled this winter. Continuous repairs and Western aid staved off a total breakdown. By Constant Mayhut. Shortly after Russia attacked a critical substation supplying power to the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, Alexei Brecht rushed to the scene on an urgent mission. Mr. Brecht, the head of operations at Ukrenergo, the national grid operator, had spent all winter trying to keep the country's power system from collapsing under an assault from Russian forces unlike anything Ukraine had ever seen. In late January, he was walking through the debris-strewn substation site, directing repairs that would be crucial for Kyiv's 3.5 million residents, when he was electrocuted and died, according to a former head of Ukrenergo, Volodymyr Kudrytsky. Mr. Brecht's death is a stark measure of Ukraine's fight to keep its energy system running during the coldest winter in a decade. From December to February, Ukraine endured 15 large-scale attacks on its energy facilities involving swarms of drones and missiles, more than 3 times the average number of attacks over the past 3 winters of war, according to data from Dixa Group, a Ukrainian energy research group. Still, thanks to round-the-clock repairs and emergency deliveries of equipment from Western partners, Ukraine pulled its energy grid back from the brink of total breakdown. As temperatures rise and the strain on the grid eases, Ukrainians can now say they have survived their harshest winter at war and look back on weeks spent in dark and cold homes, sometimes without running water for days. It was infrastructure warfare designed to make civilian life fail and to trigger a humanitarian crisis, said Vladislav Mikhanik, director of the Kyiv Energy and Climate Lab, another research group. Russia was deliberately testing how to freeze cities by striking the most sensitive links of urban systems at the worst possible moment. Earlier Russian campaigns to plunge Ukrainians into cold and darkness caused widespread damage, but they failed to bring down the grid because Moscow spread its strikes across the country, knocking no facilities completely out of service, said Maria Saturian, an analyst at the energy research group Ukraine Facility Platform. What changed this winter was both the weather, temperatures plunged well below freezing for weeks, and the tactics. Energy experts say the Russian campaign followed a scorched earth approach. Russia repeatedly struck the same facilities to obliterate them, targeting every link in the energy chain: power plants, substations transmitting electricity, gas pipelines, and boiler houses. Instead of attacking the grid broadly, as it has done in previous years, Ms. Saturian said, Russia sought to break it into isolated pockets that could be crushed one by one. It targeted transmission lines to stop electricity from being redistributed between regions, then systematically battered power facilities within each cutoff zone. On several occasions, Ukraine's grid appeared close to collapse. On the last day of January, virtually all of Kyiv went dark for a few hours, according to data shared by DTEK, the country's largest private energy company and the capital's electricity distributor. That month, Kyiv residents spent half of every day without power on average. Dmytro Zubal, a 32-year-old sales manager who lives in a district of Kyiv that was left without heat after a nearby power plant was destroyed, said he had not bothered buying a thermometer to measure how cold his apartment had gotten. When I was talking, you could see steam coming out from my mouth, he recalled. Moscow began its energy infrastructure campaign in eastern Ukraine. The region's grid is particularly vulnerable because it cannot draw power from the shuttered Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in southeast Ukraine. The plant has been under Russian occupation since the war's early days. Eastern Ukraine has since become largely dependent on smaller power plants, and Russia bombed them relentlessly. Maxim Timchenko, the chief executive of DTEK, which owns 2 thermal power plants in the eastern Dnipropetrovsk region, compared the situation to living in a circle of destruction and repair. By December, Russia turned its sights on Kyiv. The capital largely relies on 3 combined heat and power plants, known as CHPPs, and a thermal power plant. Additional supplies flow from nuclear plants in western Ukraine through the Kyivska substation, the one that was damaged in late January. All those facilities have sustained direct hits this winter, according to public statements and interviews with Ukrainian lawmakers and energy industry executives. One of the most frequently attacked sites is known as CHPP-4, which supplies heat to about 1,100 multi-story buildings and dozens of schools and hospitals in Kyiv. After 5 missiles slammed into the facility in early February, the plant was forced to halt heat supplies indefinitely, the government said. 500,000 residents were left with stone-cold radiators as outdoor temperatures plunged to as low as 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The attack left the plant so battered that Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said that repairs would take at least 2 months. With the facility's strategic value largely gone, the Ukrainian authorities turned the plant into a showcase of damage from Russia's strike campaign for visiting foreign delegations, leading them past twisted, blackened pipes as welders patched holes in them. Russia also repeatedly hit infrastructure connected with the 3 operating plants in western Ukraine, which provided much of the country's power. A report by the International Atomic Energy Agency noted that from mid-November to mid-February, at least 7 attacks severed power lines linked to the plants, forcing them to reduce output. At a recent news conference, the Ukrainian government said the country had faced a shortfall of 5 to 6 gigawatts this winter, roughly a third of what it needs during peak consumption. The intensity of the crisis was reflected in Ukraine's response. In past winters, Kyiv urged its international partners to provide it with spare equipment to repair damaged power plants. But Russia's attacks were so relentless this time that facilities often came under fire again soon after being restored, nullifying the benefit of the repairs. So rather than focusing only on repairs, Ukrainian officials also strove to secure backup power in the form of diesel generators and boiler units sent by Western nations. Trucks carrying the equipment crossed the country roughly every other day. A full-blown humanitarian crisis was also averted in part thanks to the patchwork of small power stations that households and businesses had installed ahead of the winter as they braced for blackouts. By late January, Ukrainians had amassed enough portable power stations to generate more than 3 gigawatts of electricity. That is roughly half of the generation capacity Ukraine lost when the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant fell under Russian occupation. Energy experts say that the authorities mostly reacted to this winter's attacks instead of anticipating them. To avoid a repeat next winter, they say, Ukraine must decentralize its grid by building smaller facilities that are harder for Russia to target, stockpile spare equipment, and better protect critical energy infrastructure with more bunkers and air defenses. Worst-case planning is not optional for Ukraine, it is a necessity, Mr. Mikhnich, the energy researcher, said. Any hope that Russia would not cross certain limits or that some red lines would hold should be gone after what Ukrainians went through this winter. A Dublin pub crawl, but hold the booze. A wander through some famed watering holes in Ireland's capital reveals a booming alcohol-free scene and a cultural shift. By Megan Specia. Condensation gathered on the front window of Dublin's Cobblestone pub on a rainy Friday evening as patrons packed inside. A circle of musicians played lively traditional reels on fiddles, tin whistles, and concertinas, while bartenders served up golden pints of lager and creamy stout. The scene looked mostly unchanged from decades before. The only difference? More and more of the pints being poured are alcohol-free. Naisha Kelly, who was slinging drinks behind the bar, said that for a growing number of patrons, losing the booze was now part of a normal night out. More people feel they can go out and have fun and not get drunk, she said. There was that stigma of not drinking that has kind of shifted. In a country where the pub has long held a near-hallowed status, there has been a substantial dip in the amount of alcohol that people, particularly younger people, are drinking. Ireland has seen a 34% drop in alcohol consumption over 2 decades, according to research published by Drinks Ireland, which represents the country's alcohol industry. The shift reflects similar trends across Europe. Alongside that, there has been an influx of new alcohol-free options. Once relegated to the margins of menus, the beverages are now found in abundance at most bars, as people want to retain the ritual of pub drinking while avoiding some of alcohol's worst consequences. A new national obsession with health has seen sea swimming, sauna sessions, and marathon training replace weekend-long pub sessions. And more people are becoming aware of the impact of booze on the body. For many, it's about a more mindful, moderate approach to alcohol rather than complete abstinence. You are still having the crack, said Susan Kelly, 30, using an Irish slang term that loosely translates as a good time. She drank with friends at Fidelity Bar, a hip haunt known for craft beers, cocktails, and a top-notch sound system. On the table in front of them, 3 beers and 1 non-alcoholic beer offered a perfect representation of the country's changing habits. Ms. Kelly said, "You're still getting that Friday night vibe without the Saturday morning hangover." Beer is still Ireland's most popular alcoholic beverage, but sales have fallen, with non-alcoholic beer increased in market share by 150% in just 5 years. 25% of the population drinks non-alcoholic beer, wine, or spirits, a 2025 government survey found. Guinness, the black stout ubiquitous in Irish pubs that is also popular among younger drinkers, has had huge success with its non-alcoholic alternative, Guinness Zero. And smaller producers are getting in on the action thanks in part to brewing innovations. Whiplash, an independent Dublin brewery that partly owns Fidelity Bar, has been brewing for a decade and in 2025 started selling its first zero-alcohol beer, the cleverly named Never Drinking Again. It now makes up about 10% of the brewery's production. "We can't make enough to meet the current demand," said Alex Laws, a founder of Whiplash. Among the drinkers crowding Fidelity Bar's olive green booths on any given day, it's nearly impossible to tell who is drinking alcohol rather than the variety of booze-free drinks that crowd the menu. Fierce Mild, the first brewery in Ireland producing only non-alcoholic beer, uses specialized yeast that limits fermentation. The bigger brands that dominate the market typically de-alcoholize their beer, a process where traditionally brewed beer is stripped of the alcohol created during fermentation. Instead, Fierce Mild only produces beer that is alcohol-free from the start. Fergal Carroll, 38, and Cathal Byrne, 38, brothers-in-law who own Fierce Mild, debuted their pale ale in 2024. "It is getting so much better with flavor and choice, and people are not pigeonholing it into a side option," Mr. Byrne said. "The need for that pub culture is still there, and there's still a love for beer, but it's kind of redefining what it is," Mr. Carroll added, explaining that it was no longer about an all-or-nothing approach. That's what Dublin's pub-goers see as the real cultural shift. It has become more socially acceptable to alternate between alcohol-free beers and the typical brews, or to forego the booze entirely. At Board, a Dublin bar opened in 2023 that features alcohol-free drinks and board games, Orla Vaughan, 50, set down her Guinness Zero in front of her as she erupted in laughter with a group of friends playing a fast-moving word game. "The selection is amazing and they actually taste really good," she said of the non-alcoholic options that make up 70% of the bar's menu. "There's no pressure to drink. You don't feel like you are being the dull one in the group." Ms. Vaughan, whose family operated pubs in the west of Ireland for generations, said she had stopped drinking for her physical and mental well-being after her mother died. "I grew up in a pub, so it was everything," Ms. Vaughan said of how her life revolved around drinking rituals. "With alcohol-free options," she added, "you still feel like you're part of it." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, March 13th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.